You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series.
My name is Peter Dredge, and joining me is Adam Jones. Adam is a principal engineer and the water efficiency lead at BMT, as well as being one of the co-chairs of the Australian Water Association's Water Efficiency Specialist Network. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
The title of the paper that you're involved in was Drought Adaptability of Large Commercial and Industrial Water Users. So, Adam, tell us the background to this research.
Yes, well, I mean, we've been doing non-residential water efficiency work for quite a long time. I've got a little team that does it. But these particular insights have come out of probably maybe over 80, I would say, particular site investigations in various regional areas that have been drought affected since probably early 2019. So all kinds of sites across the Greater Sydney, Hunter, New England, Central Tablelands regions in particular.
Give us an insight into the types of businesses and organisations that you visited.
Yeah, well, it's a relatively wide range of large industrial production, meat and livestock related sites, some mines, some swimming pools, playing fields, retail, shopping centres, hospitals, aged care, correctional centres, showgrounds, car washes, all kinds of different businesses.
You've outlined what are a series of assumptions, I suppose, that you have gone on to debunk largely. The first one you identify here is the assumption that there is no technical capacity to adapt inside these organisations or on these sites.
That's more a perception externally that, you can imagine somebody sitting in a water utility or a council and thinking, look, I don't want to bother these commercial water users because, I mean, they had a really good go at this last drought, and I'm sure they're already, doing their very best, and we don't want to try and get blood from a stone, don't want to kind of mess anything up there, and so there's kind of a reticence maybe to, or an assumption that there's no kind of, you can't go further. We don't want to kind of put unreasonable demands on business, which I can understand as well. But I think it's probably the myth I'm debunking there is that there are no improvements that can be made, and I guess even to our surprise, like we're probably more commonly seeing. I mean, if we talk general numbers, I'm thinking maybe 20 to 50% opportunities for the majority of sites. Wow. There's sort of outliers either side, and that's not kind of fully pushing the boat out on cost either. That's mostly sort of options under 2 to 3 year payback period on just sort of basic water and maybe energy in some cases costs. And so there are, which is quite big numbers, I think.
What about that external assumption that there is no drive to adapt inside these organisations?
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. I'm not sure if it's more of a social question in some ways, but something that we've noticed is that especially the large water users often cop a lot of flack, I think, for the community, especially when water supply becomes a concern. There's that attitude of, look, what's the point in me doing my bit when those guys down the road are using squillions of times more than me? They're the problem, and they don't care. They're owned overseas or they're owned interstate, and so what could they possibly care about this community? And so that's something that we had the opportunity to kind of work with the individuals in these organisations, and so that was enlightening for me, at least, that the individuals in these organisations are part of the community, and they their friends and their family live there, and they're extremely invested in the viability of the growth and the prosperity of the region. You want to, if you're working at a plant, then you want to make sure that there's investment from your organisation in that town, in that plant, and you want to grow it. And so in general, the bias against these organisations seemed unfounded in the people we were engaging with. We saw people who were very keen to make any kind of change and improvements that they can. The dynamic, I don't know if there is a complicated dynamic in terms of to get funding to do things, you do need to work within your kind of company systems. And I think for most commercial businesses, you've got to sort of demonstrate a business case which has a return on investment and some level of certainty around it. And so I think that's more the challenge. It's what we observe for these organizations is that you can't, just because the community goes into drought, suddenly pull the trigger on all these suddenly expensive options just to do it. That's not how it works. It still needs to fit within that kind of commercial sort of bandwidth. And I think that's probably a key observation. That's in terms of connecting the expectations of the community and these organizations. That's a key key opportunity, I think, to cross that gap. If people realize that, like in your home, if you go into drought, then you can shorten your showers and stop your irrigation and try and be sort of reuse your laundry water. You can do all sorts of little things, upgrade your washing machine, all that kind of stuff. You can kind of make a big impact by changing your behavior. Whereas like a large production plant or a hospital, or they're less immediately agile to simply just using less water. Instead, they'd need to kind of invest in a project to get that happening, and they'd still need to justify that spend. So there's a different dynamic there, but the willingness, I would actually say, is quite high.
Which leads on to the point you make about these large commercial and industrial sites actually craving useful support, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So if you can imagine that dynamic that I believe I've observed, where the individuals are quite motivated to improve as much as they can, and they just have to work within their natural kind of commercial context. There's a huge opportunity to provide support. I mean, from a technical perspective, I mentioned before that the organizations just don't have necessarily the expertise or the funds or the time to kind of necessarily look under every rock, especially when it comes to water, which is not their most expensive bill, I suppose. So that can be a real benefit when looking at what opportunities are out there. If you, and that's often what we're doing, going in with a blank slate, and people are saying, look, is there anything here? I don't think there is. I think we've done what we can, but can we have a set of fresh eyes to see if that's really the case, or if there's anything kind of hiding there? That's an obvious kind of gap that can be external support. And I think one of the reasons that it's almost more effective externally as an external support or external funding is because you can imagine if you're the manager for a site trying to get approval for some capital to bring somebody in to have a look around and see if there's anything to be found, when you can't think that there is. The answer is probably going to come back from the upper levels saying, well, no, look yourself. And if there's only, you can't have the money unless you think that you've fixed everything yourself. So it's a kind of a complicated dynamic. Whereas if someone comes in with external funding or government funding and says, look, it's great if you're doing great already, that's great, but we're just having a look to see what else is there, and suddenly they find a handful of things that could make a real big dent. It's a whole different kind of conversation. So that's one way where, and that's a lot of what we do anyway. But I think that's something that hasn't happened in some regions very much at all. Sort of, it's been more of a focus in kind of larger urban areas, larger water utilities that have kind of different budget arrangements and that kind of thing. And also, there's an interesting question then around where do you go from there? If say you've found that there is significant potential at a site, how do you turn that into a step change in their water use? How do you lock that in? And so there's kind of a whole other kind of set of, honestly, barriers and hurdles I've observed, and we're less. I'm probably less of an expert in following everything through. We're kind of more experts in the identification, but it is true that just because you find great option that's pay itself off in 6 weeks doesn't necessarily mean that they can snap your fingers and make it happen. There's I mentioned before, there's things like business cases, and there's kind of internal stakeholder issues and concerns and all that kind of thing, and so one of the things that I imagine, and this is kind of me speculating, it's probably maybe it's a policy thing, but I might be speaking out of turn, but I'd imagine that having some access to ongoing technical support, but also something like the right kind of incentive. One of the things that I think is interesting about a financial incentive for implementation is actually just bumping it up the priority list. If you have like a limited time only way of incentivizing an option, then it kind of turns people's attention to it. I think it's probably helpful to imagine that these sites are being run in general by people who have got probably 50 things on their plate at any one time. They can only kind of get to 20 of them, and so honestly, there's a lot of ideas that are probably sitting there and waiting. And if there's an interest, I guess, more broadly for the community and for the region in locking in lower levels of water use, then maybe an incentive that just kind of bumps that up the urgency list could actually be all that's needed. It's a speculative idea, but
I was interested to see that, you talk about the risk of this sort of overarching adversarial relationship existing between, outside bodies and the individual organizations. And it sort of leads you to think that these relationships and initiatives and discussions need to be had away from the risk of enforced restrictions, right? We need to do it in the downtime and the good times to actually embed some of this, right?
I think you're dead right, because you can imagine. I mean, you can imagine the empathy from a business's point of view if they've never heard from you until all of a sudden the dam levels are low. Probably on some level terrified that for a lot of these organizations, if you demand a 20% reduction, for example, that's a really crude method that I know has been used, say in the past, a 10% or a 20% reduction, without kind of understanding how the business works and how the business uses water, then you could essentially shut the place down for some of these organizations. They run kind of on quite a finely tuned system. The opposite to that is if, as you say, if you're engaging with these businesses anyway and building that relationship and providing what I think is genuine support to their operations, then it could be quite a productive win-win, in my opinion. Yeah, engaging kind of proactively would be one of those tips.
What's your main takeout? How would you summarize your findings for perhaps those people that held those misconceptions?
I mean, I guess my key message would be that from what we're seeing, there appears to be a real significant opportunity in the non-residential water user space to embed some very large reductions in water use. I say numbers like sort of 20 to 50% being really common, and I can forgive people for being wary of that. Intuitively, it's the sort of thing which seems too good to be true. But it is what we're seeing, and with quite a good return on investment. So the numbers are out there, and I think that's really exciting in terms of what that could mean for water supplies in many of these areas, being able to measurably lock in these quite significant step changes in water demands. What that also could help mean for local businesses in terms of improving their bottom line. I think it's a really exciting opportunity. But I would also kind of want to underline that it's a slightly different way of thinking than maybe traditional approaches to water efficiency, which might be looking at kind of leakage reduction or supply augmentation or various residential kind of rebate programs or marketing to sort of behavior change in the home. All of those things are good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating against them at all, but I think it's a slightly different mindset. Looking at the non-residential sector, you have to sort of be willing to engage much more specifically, I think, on a site-by-site basis and not necessarily know the numbers you're going to get before you go in. But what we're seeing is the numbers are definitely there if you're willing to take that punt.
I've been speaking with Adam Jones. Adam is a principal engineer and the water efficiency lead at BMT, as well as being one of the co-chairs of the Australian Water Association's Water Efficiency Specialist Network. Thanks for your time, Adam.
Thanks, Peter. Much appreciated.